Well, good morning and welcome to an FS Club webinar. I'm dialing in from here in London, and I'm delighted to have with me Dr. Jessica Borge, or as I tease her, Dr. Jessica Borgia, but she's not in any way affected. And she's here to talk about socially progressive corporations, the historic London Rubber Company. It is in aid of a book, but we won't hold that against her. In fact, it means that she's thoroughly qualified on the subject, and we're looking forward to it. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce lectures and webinars on a whole variety of topics to do with technology, economics, and finance. We may be stretching things a little bit. In fact, I think there'll be a few puns along those lines during the session. But I feel very much that socially progressive corporations and the London Rubber Company are very, very important, particularly as you look back in the current era of ESG and CSR, corporate social responsibility, environmental, social, and governance, and begin to realize that many of these concepts go back many centuries, in fact, whether it's the Quakers or many of the other companies. And I think the London Rubber Company is a particularly interesting one. And so we're delighted that Jessica is here with us today. Now, the format, as ever, will be that I will get out of the way and let you hear from the expert. We have a very vibrant session today. There'll be 4 polls and a video, so bear with us as the technology moves. But might I point out that we're going to have quite a bit of time for questions and answers, so please use the go-to question and answer facility. I'm here with you, so I won't get your emails or texts until it's too late, and I'll feed those into the conversation with Jessica. And with that, if I may, Jessica, no more ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So let's have the first slide, please. Okay, so I wear 2 hats. I am a research fellow at the School of Advanced Study, University of London, but I also work at the King's College London Archives. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? So that's where I usually live on a good day, among the stacks with all the papers. So I'm going to be a historian today, and I'm talking to you with my historian's hat on. So we're going to go back to the golden age of the London Rubber Company. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? Which I do happen to have written a book about quite recently, where there's a lot more information available should anybody out there need it. Next slide, please, Michael. So the first thing I want to know before we go on is, who are all of you? You know who I am? Who are you?
And I've just put the poll up there, Jessica, and people are going to give you their background. We've half the audience have voted. I'll leave it open for another 5 or 6 seconds. Now up to well over 3/4 of the audience, just about to close the poll. And I'll display the results. And that should give you a flavor of your audience. So very much financial services and other. But even 10% in the creative industries and heritage, 12% in education, 16% in technology. So it's a good spread here.
That's great. And the reason I asked that is because, of course, this is an FS Club event, and usually we'd had lots of financial services and tech people. I'm a historian. I've invited some of my cronies along. And what we're going to do today is try to assess how much of a socially responsible company London Rubber was. So that's the reason I've asked that. So I think we're on the next slide, aren't we, Michael, with a nice picture of the factory of the London Rubber Company there. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, lovely. I think so. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background on this company. I'm very invested in it, I'm sure you gathered. So it was founded in Aldersgate Street, that's within the City of London, in 1915, so that's Michael's patch. They were manufacturing in Chingford, which is in North London, from about 1939 to 1994, but there was a little gap in the early 1930s when they were manufacturing in Hackney. Now, they were once the biggest employer in Chingford. Thousands of people worked there, mothers, daughters, aunties, uncles, all the family worked at the Rubber, as it was known. And it also employed thousands of people globally, right up until about the late 1990s, when things started to dwindle down, and its main brands started getting bought out by other companies. But now I've got a question for all of you out there. What do you think London Rubber made?
Great. I was just about to launch that poll, folks. So you've got a choice here of men's and women's contraceptives, children's balloons and rubber gloves, disposable underwear, or wine. You might think there's a hint in the name, but now our audience, as ever, is very quick off the mark here. Jessica, believe it or not, over 80% have voted in about 15 seconds. I'm just about to close the poll now, and I'll share those results with you as well. And you can see here that 68% say men's contraceptives, 4% say women's. I think we'll be learning more in a moment. 23% on children's balloons and rubber gloves, 6% on disposable underwear, and nobody believes that it made any wine at all. So I'll just pull up the next slide on a selection of products.
Well, Michael, it was a bit of a trick question, I'm afraid. I tricked you all. London Rubber made all of those things except wine. It didn't make wine, but London Rubber was a leading force in wine supermarkets in the UK in the 1960s, if you can believe it. But condoms were primarily what they made. That was where the profit was. We'll talk a little bit more about the technology later, which made those so profitable. But they did make women's contraceptives. We'll talk about that later as well. Rubber gloves was a very big product for London Rubber. So Marigold rubber gloves, that was them. Children's balloons, they were the biggest children's balloon manufacturer in the UK. That was because they had more latex than anybody in the UK. So anyone of a certain age who's British might remember Ariel brand. Michael, you've got your hand up.
Do you have any props by any chance, Jessica?
I do have a few genuine 1960s London Rubber condoms. Aren't they lovely? I do have some balloon artifacts, but I forgot to bring them out today, sorry. We can show you some more condoms later though. Let's have the next slide. Lovely. So I thought you'd all want to see some pictures from my personal collection. Now, this is a very important condom, believe it or not, because London Rubber really became successful in the period over World War II. So just before World War II was when the company really got going, when it was investing in new technology. They just moved to North London. Literally within months, war broke out. And by 1942, they were forcing up production because they had a government contract to produce condoms. And this is one of them. Next slide, please, Michael. So here we've got some condoms from the 1950s. As you will note, they are in paper packets, which means that the latex doesn't last for very long. It becomes oxygenated. But if we go to the next slide, please, Michael, we will see the foiled packages. So this is the first lubricated condom. This is Durex Gossamer. It was London Rubber's biggest seller. They had a massive margin on it and it was so popular, and this is what kept them going through the golden age, the 1960s. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? So here we've got the technology behind London Rubber. Now, I've just published an article about that, which I think has been circulated to you all. You can read it if you want to. But we've got a little video, so I'm going to switch my camera off for a moment so you can see these wonderful machines in action.
Okay, and I'm just about to show the video. Give me a moment, folks.
Since no one would rely on such a device if it was known to tear or burst in use, one layer of latex is not considered enough. A second layer is inseparably bonded to the first to give double reliability and strength while still being extremely thin. The enormous popularity of the protective, it's as popular as all other methods added together, no doubt owes much not only to its simplicity, but also to the reliance which can be placed upon it, thanks to these finished products all being individually inspected and then tested electronically on this automatic machine. Every one goes through the test, and even the tiniest hole, a small weakness even, can be detected by the machine. The few imperfect products are then automatically segregated and thrown out. The perfect products, now guaranteed perfect, pass on and are taken off the machine for packing. Nowadays, before packing, the protectives are often impregnated with lubricant, a refinement which makes them considerably more satisfactory in use. Strong, efficient, harmless, thoroughly reliable, why then are other methods even considered? Well, bluntly put, some men and some women find the protective disturbing, and that's not going to lead to a happy marriage. So long as there are no objections, the modern protective, with or without spermicide, successfully meets the needs of most people, and is used by more people than any other.
Wasn't that great fun? I think that's got to be my favourite film of all time, Michael.
It's actually really good to see it in action, and it reminds us of what a big production company that was.
Yeah, they were very proud of this technology, and rightly so. It was all designed in-house, patented in the UK, and it was probably the biggest barrier to competition apart from the Durex brand. Let's have the next slide, please, Michael. So bearing in mind that we are dealing with history here, we're dealing with the past, we're in the 1960s. That was really the golden age for the London Rubber Company, with that lubricated condom that we saw earlier and all of that fabulous automated technology which made lubrication integral to the production process, never done before. As you can see, and I mean, if you out there in the audience can see this, it's quite small writing on this chart. But basically in the 1960s, towards the beginning of the 1960s, don't forget, this is when the pill was coming out, London Rubber was doing really well, and it really upped production. It installed a few more of those automated lines for making condoms. It was doing really well. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? Now, one of the reasons the 1960s is such an important era is because it's the last of the old guard at London Rubber. This was a family firm. It was started by Lionel Alfred Jackson in 1915. The first hire outside of the company in about 1923, I think, was a guy called Angus Reed, and he was managing director right up until the 1970s when this guy, Edward Howard, took charge. Now, Michael, don't get jealous. That could be you if you play your cards right. He was Lord Mayor of London. If you behave yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I knew his son, Sir David Howard, and their son, his grandson, Robert Howard, remains an alderman of the City of London today.
Well, there you go. You know, that's tradition for you. It really wasn't it was a sea change in the company. By the 1970s, the people who'd been directing it for many, many decades, many of whom were part of the Jackson family, but some, like Angus Reed, weren't. They just got to that age where it was time for retirement and time to get a new board in, and this marks the point at which it happened. But we're going to be dealing with the 60s, so let's go to the next slide. So this brings up the question of what is a socially progressive company? So I'm hoping you can all help me by telling me what a socially progressive company is.
I've launched that poll now. We have political activism, social and community focus, environmental policy, equitable treatment of personnel, or works for profit. And while folks are completing that, I just share with you a comment from Edward Nicol that the plant was very impressive. I remember being shown around as a rather embarrassed young rubber trader. LRC was one of my biggest companies for 60% of during my trading days in the 60s and 70s. So thank you for that, Edward. Great, and I'm now going to close the poll and share the results. And you'll see that an interesting spread here. So 13% on activism, 77% on social and community focus, 62% on equitable treatment of personnel, 40% on environmental policy, and 21% works for profit.
That's very interesting. I'm glad that there's a nice spread of opinion on this, because this is very much about a historical case in a historical context. And what's clear to me, bearing in mind, you know, I'm not a business person, Michael, I'm just a historian, but it seems to me that these things change quite a lot over time, depending on what else is going on in society. So I'm glad that we have a mix of opinion here. Okay, so which slide are we on then, Michael? I've lost you. Oh, there we go.
No,
all right, so everybody, this is where I first began to have an inkling that there was something going on at the London Rubber Company beyond just the production of condoms. Now, let's get one thing straight before we go on. London Rubber was profit-centred. It was profit first and foremost. It pretty much had the monopoly on condoms in the UK after the war, and it clung to that. It was accused of a number of anti-competitive practices. There were no less than 3 monopolies and mergers investigations between the 70s and the 90s. So profit was at the forefront of everything they did. They were known for it, and a lot of people didn't like them because of it. So I was quite surprised when I was looking through some of the paperwork. There isn't really an archive, but there's correspondence with them at the Family Planning Association archive, which is at the Wellcome Library. And I was a bit surprised when I came across some of this correspondence, and I found these little stickers on everything. So I don't know if you can see in the corner there, it's a little lick-on stamp. You lick it and stick it. And that's for polio research. And these were stuck all over some of the correspondence from the 50s, and it's just ordinary business correspondence. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a nobody who had stuck these on. It was the managing director, Angus Reid. And it made me think, maybe there's a sort of ethos at the company that's worth investigating. So let's go on to the next slide, Michael. So I'm going to make this quite fast. We don't have that much time, but I just want to give you 3 examples of things that happened at the company that made me look at them a little bit differently and not just look at them as a for-profit producer. One of the things that really struck me during my research was this very quiet emphasis that they had on medicine and welfare. So one of the things that London Rubber did was it had an absolutely free R&D service that it offered to mainly to surgeons, but other types of medics as well, to develop instruments and also obviously latex-based products such as catheters, little tubes, that sort of thing, that surgeons needed in the course of their work. And they did this very quietly. They shouted about a lot of things at London Rubber, but they didn't shout about this. And it all used the in-house ingenuity of their engineers and their chemists. Another very striking story is this little girl. Her name was Anne. She was the daughter of one of the directors of London Rubber. And what she's doing here is she's dipping her arm into a latex cast. That was because a local businessman in the early 1960s, in response to the thalidomide crisis, started developing some artificial limbs, and the engineers at London Rubber helped him out. I don't think it got very far. It was quite clunky and mechanical. But London Rubber, again, very quietly, put some time and energy and some investment into this to help a local businessman who ran a charity, who ran a music group with a number of disabled members, just experimenting and trying out with this synthetic limb, this skin for the synthetic limb, because they had the technology. Could we go to the next slide, please, Michael? Now, I'm often asked why I'm interested in the London Rubber Company, and I'm afraid people usually expect that I'm very interested in sex and condoms, and you know, I think everybody is, but the most interesting thing for me is just the people. Thousands of people were employed at London Rubber. I mean, if we just talk about Chingford, which was the main plant, they had factories all over the place, making all sorts of different things, you know, like disposable underpants. If we just talk about Chingford, they had so much going on in their community of employees, the workforce. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? So I've listed some of the initiatives that not necessarily that the company was responsible for. A lot of these initiatives were run by the employees, but I think it's very telling that they went on for a very long time and they were supported by the company. So a couple of things that we can mention here is the employment of women. So from the 1930s, when London Rubber started, its core workforce on the production line was women, and some of them were minors. They were 14. They weren't minors in the 1930s, of course, but they were very young. Now, that's not unusual. It was a factory. It was North London. It had a large, skilled working class population. But what's really lovely about London Rubber is their retention of the female workforce. So after the war, the women don't disappear. They stay on, and their daughters get employed and their nieces get employed and they meet their husbands there. There's so many pictures of weddings, Michael, in the company magazines. You just weddings, weddings, weddings of people who met at London Rubber. The other thing that's really striking is they really had a policy of equitable opportunity. This was not a city firm. It was not an old boys club. Things changed in the 70s and 80s, and it became a city firm, sort of, eventually. But for the most part, from the 30s to the 60s, this was a family-run firm, and it was entirely possible to work your way up. And that includes women as well. The global sales manager was a woman in the early 1970s. One of the other things that's very striking in the images from the company magazine, and that's where these images come from, is the mix of people that there were at London Rubber. Anyone who knows a little bit about British history will know that there was a great deal of Commonwealth immigration. My mother was included in that in the 1950s and the 1960s. And London Rubber was an employer, anybody who wanted a job there, and there was an opportunity to move up and to move forward. The other thing I'll just mention before we move on is the pension and share options. Now, in those photographs, if you look at the top line of photos, and there's 4 guys who are holding out gold watches. The one with the black hair is my friend John Harvey. John Harvey got company shares when London Rubber went public. Actually, he was there a few years after they went public, and he bought his family home. He cashed in his shares and he bought his family home, and I think that's fabulous. Could we have the next slide, please, Michael? So this is really my last case study. I'm going to start wrapping up now because we're nearly at time. But this whole idea of women's contraception. Now, condoms were really, really profitable. Once you had the technology in place, the profits were amazing, closely guarded secret. The profit that retailers could make was really, really high. So without a doubt, the #1 product at London Rubber was the condom. But they invested loads of time and energy and research into developing women's contraceptives. Now, I personally feel that there were a number of reasons for doing that. You can read more about it in the book. But I think it's good to remember that well into the 1970s, London Rubber was still trying to develop different types of contraceptive technology, and that was very much in response to what was going on in society, but of course what was going on in the marketplace. Could we have the next slide, please? Actually, it's a poll next, isn't it, Michael? So I presented everybody. It is. I presented you all with some case studies, and I would like to know if you think London Rubber was socially progressive in the 60s or not.
Great. Well, 3/4 of the audience have voted. It's a very lively audience out there, and there are quite a few people there. Please do get your questions, comments, or observations in fairly early, and I'll start feeding them into a conversation with Jessica in just a moment. And I'm now about to close the poll and share those results, and basically convince the audience.
Well, you know, it wasn't actually my goal to convince anybody. London Rubber got up to a number of things. You know, those monopolies and mergers commissions investigations were not unwarranted. But they had good reason for investigating London Rubber, and there's a lot more evidence I haven't been able to present to you because of the time we've got. But I'm glad that my hunch as a historian and my feeling of a different side to this company. I'm glad that other people are sensing that as well. So I'm not going to read out everything to you on the last slide. You can read it for yourself. London Rubber had a long history. It went way beyond the 1960s. They started to shut up shop in the 1990s. Obviously, if we're looking at social responsibility, the AIDS crisis is something very important, and I've spoken and written about that elsewhere. The question is, if we can take just a small moment in time and make a long-form judgment about a company based on small pockets of time, and that's very much a question that's on people's minds at the moment. So I just wanted to give you all some food for thought. I'm happy to have feedback. Michael, I think that's it. We can go to the last slide.
Fantastic. Well, we've got quite a few questions here, so folks, please do send them in. But thank you very much, Jessica. And I'd just like to start with a few of the comments and questions that are here. First one really is from Bob McDowell. He says, socially progressive companies do take some of the tax burden away from the taxpayer. But he's curious, and I think quite a few people are curious about, where did it all go wrong? Did London Rubber fall victim to the obsession, which continues, of creating competition for competition's sake, and the expectation that competition results in efficiency, lower costs, and consumer benefits? So basically, does monopoly supplier fall short of, being a real ESG fulfilled firm?
Well, I mean, a lot of that's going to be a matter of conjecture. One of the problems with the London Rubber Company is there's no historically available archive. I mean, the best view that we have onto the internal life of the company is the annual reports. But I think that sea change into the 1970s is very important. And we should just look at their diversification in the 1980s, when they went into pottery, photography, all sorts of things. So I don't have a yes or no answer on that. You might have to read the book and come up with your own conclusions. I think there's a lot more in there.
Now, an interesting one from Bob Thompson. He's the GXP archivist for Reckitt Benckiser, who now own Durex. When did LRC begin and end their relationship with Durex?
Oh, well, Durex was an LRC invention, so it was patented in about 1929, but the company wasn't making condoms at that stage. They started making condoms in 1932. They left Chingford in 1994, and the London Rubber Company itself started to get wrapped up towards the end of the 1990s. It still exists as a holding company, but from the end of the 1990s, that's when the Durex brand was sold on, first to Seton Scholl and then to Reckitt Benckiser, who now own the brand and are doing lovely things with it.
It's kind of interesting here. A lot of people are interested in this monopolistic behavior and focusing on it. Ian Harris points out that their monopolistic behavior was a barrier to trade. Anyway, and Con Keating says, that in the 1960s, these condoms were very expensive, 3 shillings and 9 pence for a packet of 3. So they were clearly benefiting. In other words, I think the question here is, oh, there we have it.
There we go.
Is it easy to be generous when you've got a monopoly to expend, I guess, is sort of the question here.
Well, the short answer to that is yes. And not all of London Rubber's condoms were that expensive. That was the most expensive star brand. But London Rubber supplied condoms to other companies who packed them. So you could get really, really cheap versions just under a different brand name.
Now, one of the things that is within the FS Club community is the ESOP Center, which promotes employee share ownership. And we've got some people here, question here, do you think they lost their way as a socially responsible company because they ceased to be a family firm? So that's kind of one element of it. So your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I'd say yes. I'd say yes. Things changed, and things changed internally, and the direction of the company changed. But of course, that was that they changed from a family firm at the cusp of the 1970s, and as we know, there was an awful lot going on in broader society in Britain in the 1970s, which also contributed to that.
An interesting question from Graham Elliott. What was the company's policy on trades union membership?
Now, this is something I haven't looked into very much, but I think it would be a very interesting question. So not having access to the company archive is obviously a bit of an issue there. If we look back over the local newspapers in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, there's quite a bit of union activity. So far as the company's attitude towards the union movement is, I really couldn't tell you. It needs more research.
Okay. You mentioned the heavy employment of women in the workforce in the factory, and I think you alluded to the fact that might not be unusual at that time. Was that because of low wages? Was that because it was believed that women were better at fiddly work, which is often a thing in that period? What was the company's reasoning, or was it a fairly open employer, just happened to employ a lot of women?
Well, once again, a lot of this is down to conjecture because the evidence is so piecemeal and it's all over the place. Women were very cheap to employ, which is why women were employed in factories quite a lot. In the case of London Rubber, there was lots and lots of working mothers, and there was also a night shift. And that actually worked quite well with women who had other jobs during the day or were looking after their families. But what I would say is that even at the lower end of the pay scale, it was still really good money at London Rubber. And as a 14-year-old in the 1930s, you could earn a really decent wage being part of the dipping line in the factory. And there were lots of divisions such as the film unit, and the film unit in the 1960s and 70s was almost entirely run by women.
Chris Seo points out that LRC, were controversial, but they were trailblazers of work practices that are now becoming norms or sought after these days. I'm sort of curious about the international aspects. Here you've got this global company coming out of Chingford, so not central London, but definitely northeast area. How much did the international character of the company affect Chingford?
Well, I mean, again, this is something I haven't researched yet. London Rubber had fingers in lots of pies all over the place, and so for my purposes I had to really keep a very close focus on Chingford. But if we look at the company magazines, we can get a really broad idea of what's going on with some branches of the company in different parts of the world. And what we do see is a lot of those social activities, that social cohesion, that idea of community among the employees seems to be pretty international. I couldn't possibly attribute that to London Rubber. Maybe it was just symptomatic of the time. I don't know.
Michael Shapiro is curious, was LRC a market leader in exporting, and in the light of their socially responsible ethic, did they export to countries around the world who really had the need for their products? Do you have any feel for sort of the balance of exports to domestic sales?
Yeah, they were very big exporters. I can't remember the exact figure, but off the top of my head, about 50% of their condom output was exported, I think, in the 50s, 60s and 70s. You'd have to check the book for the exact figure. So yeah, exporting was really important for them. They also set up some plants in other countries, in India in the 1960s, for example. And that's very interesting because that's a period when the international, charitable, progressive part of the family planning movement is trying to supply free contraceptives. So there's a whole question there over who actually needs this type of contraception, what type of contraception they need. Is the pill a better option? Do people actually want it? Or are we just imposing a very specific set of values on what were then called third world countries? So London Rubber was very active globally. It was trying to get itself on the agenda for some of these international family planning aid programs. It's very difficult to find detailed archival information on that.
I'm sort of curious as well, how much of this was due to the Commonwealth? We would see sort of, I think, fairly similar attitudes of the late 40s, 50s, and 60s at, take, for example, British Leyland. Was it piggybacking on the Commonwealth in these overseas sales, or was it genuinely competitive?
Yeah, they were totally a Commonwealth company, and they were also pushing for membership of the EU in their own small way. London Rubber wasn't really political. It didn't give to political parties. That's not something it did. But in the early 1960s, when there was that possibility of going into the EU, that's not what it was called then, of course. Yeah, but they were really making provision for that, and we can account for their subsidiaries in Europe, so the Netherlands and Germany and so on and so forth, in that early period of the 60s, because they're envisioning having seamless trade within the European community.
Benjamin Myers curious, did LRC keep up its progressive nature in its overseas plants as well?
Well, again, this is something that I don't know for certain, and the whole question of whether they are socially progressive or not, I think, that's something I've thrown out to the audience again today. In many ways, I think it's a matter of opinion, especially when you look at some of the other activities, some of the other things that they got up to. It's not a massive company. It's not a times 100 huge company, but they had outposts all over the place, and I think that would be a second book.
Okay. Now, you apparently have many fellow researchers online. I'll read out a comment from Bruce Mackay, if I might. In Beijing in 2000, I asked the shopkeeper which of the 50-plus brands in his condom cabinet was the best. Durex, he said. Why, I asked. Because they're made in England. They weren't, of course, they were made in Thailand. So interesting there. A couple of questions here. A lot of people, as I say, are kind of curious where it all went wrong, and I'd be curious what you thought. Was it because they diversified too much? Bob McDowell says he wonders if they were unconsciously veering towards being a conglomerate, a business model which, as we know, has fallen out of fashion. Did they fall out because the market changed and the pill basically ruined the condom market? Did they fall out due to bad management? Any thoughts on? There's never one cause, but a primary cause, perhaps.
I would say it's there was a management reorganization of the company that was happening in the 1960s, and that really came to fruition at the beginning of the 1970s when there was this big change of board. And also, some people in the company say it was when the Americans came in that everything changed. So there were a couple of American board members who were brought in from Julius Schmid, who were a big condom manufacturer in the States that London Rubber bought out in the early 1960s. Really from the 1970s, it was becoming a conglomerate. They were losing focus on the condom. The condom was never knocked out of the market by the pill. In the United Kingdom, the condom was the #1 contraceptive method, the #1 contraceptive appliance method, right up until 1974, which is when the pill became free. And when that happened, when you could get the pill for free, there was a real sea change and they started to diversify. It's very interesting that they moved away from condoms. So by the time you get to the AIDS crisis, they've actually reduced, the contribution of condoms to group profits is really much smaller than it was. And they don't start to refocus on condoms until the early 90s when the company's in real trouble. So I think it was a lack of, not a lack of focus, but a changing in focus, combined with just changing out the management completely and the falling away of the original members of the company, the old guard, the family members, the directors who'd been there for decades and had seen it grow and contributed to it.
Okay. Well, we've got time for 2 more questions. The last question is going to be quite discursive, I suspect, but just to follow up here on this a bit about international, and you mentioned the American acquisition. Greg Ray is curious, did LRC compete directly with American brands in Commonwealth countries? And how much of the North American market, US, Mexico, Canada, did they penetrate? I think our audience is trying to throw me a lot of double entendres here, but anyway, I'll leave it to you to get back to Greg on that.
In my business, Michael, you get double entendres thrown at you all the time. Quite used to it. London Rubber didn't have to compete with American firms and Commonwealth companies because they were the main firm. They were British, and they were the main firm. So if you look at New Zealand or Australia, for example, it's Durex. Everybody knows what it is. In terms of the American market, in the 1990s, London Rubber tried to make Durex a global brand. And this is where they tried to penetrate the American market in a big way by actually selling condoms as Durex. It was moderately successful. Really, it takes condoms are very special. People don't switch brands. They stick with what they know and what they feel safe with. And so that was, it was almost doomed to failure. So Durex is known in North America and in Canada, and you can buy them there. But ultimately, London Rubber decided to rescind that decision to try and really push Durex, and just invested in the American brands that it already had over there. It just made more sense.
Okay. I'm getting a number of comments of praise for your presentation, which is always a reminder I have to pull things to a close in a moment. Just a comment from Tangi Morgan, followed by a question from David Seidel. Tangi says, funny that the time frame that you focus on and the socially progressive organization is now what we are looking at organizations to do to be more equitable to customers and employees. And David's question is, it seems that the definition of social responsibility has changed over the years. What differences would there be in defining it today from this period, say in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think the main thing, from what I can see, is political activism. And I think that these days there's much more of an expectation that companies will be politically active, even if that doesn't mean giving directly to political parties. It might mean supporting lobby groups of one kind or another, or unofficial lobbies, you know, the social media lobby. There's so many social issues at the moment that companies sometimes feel they must be seen to support. And I think that really differentiates what was happening with London Rubber in the 60s. There was no end of social causes that they could have supported then had they wanted to. It was the 1960s. But their socially responsible work, that component, it seemed to happen in other ways.
Well, there are a lot of further questions and comments and observations. I will be sending all of those over to Jessica with your email so that you can get back. I'll point out one here just made by Con Keating, that in the US there was a brand of vacuum flask, a thermos, called Durex, and the top seller in the US was, I think, Trojan. It's great to have a very well-informed audience here. They clearly take this seriously. Anyway, unfortunately, all good things must burst, come to an end, and so I will conclude really, if I may, with 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors. You do let us range widely and freely, and we appreciate it. And I hope that people took, despite some of the light humor, there is a serious component here about what does it mean to be a socially progressive corporation. And I certainly take away from this: 1, it's not new. 2, it does change a bit over time, and 3, no organization is pure. And I think those are some really good points that you've made here and convinced us about, Jessica. Secondly, I'd like to thank the audience. You've held it together. It was very good, just en point. But we do have, of course, a pretty packed week next week. As ever, I won't read these out, but just go to the website and see what's happening. But we do kick off Monday at 3 on what is the post-pandemic office going to look like, which I know everybody's interested in. And we continue with the program as you see here. But of course, my heartfelt thanks really has to go to Jessica. I met Jessica when she was working at King's College London, KCL, in the archives with another friend of mine, Jeff Browell. And I couldn't believe how open and fun she made her PhD research seem. I'm delighted she was awarded a degree without question, but even more delighted she's managed to take all of that research and turn it into a book, which I heartily recommend to all of you. Jessica, in these days of technology, I find it tough enough showing videos from 1964, so I'm not going to try and open the floodgates of applause, which I'm sure would be there, but I must in fact try and use, therefore, my ersatz Korean karmic clapper, and thank you on behalf of the audience. And we look forward to further work and research in this area and volume 2 of Protective Practices. Thank you.